Hello and welcome to this video. This video I'm going to show you how you can make a blockout tool. So this blockout tool is then very useful to in Unreal make specific shapes that we want to have for our level. So we can use these shapes then in our procedural terrains. So here in Houdini, let's start out with a geometry network. And in there we're going to create a curve node. What will be important here when we create our curve is that we zoom out enough in our scene. So in here I can see clearly the number 25. So that will be a decent size when we open the tool in Unreal. Then I'm also going to enable the grid snapping. So you can enable it here, or you can hold the X button and you will see a little circle. So now just gonna click a random shape. Like this, for example, a very basic shape. And from this basic shape, I will generate 3 different types. So one type will be a big chunk, will be basically an extrusion of this. Then another one will be a sort of like more a sweep. So we will have a sweep around the shape. And another one is the other mode is that we have actually sort of like models copied on these points. So for example, if I want to quickly place mountains around my scene, I can just draw a curve and there will be mountains there. So let's start out by adding our first system, and I will use an add node. In the add node, I will go to the polygon menu, click by group and select close. So now it's one big primitive. It's also possible here in a curve to close it, but since I will have 3 different methods, I rather do every method their separate closing of the shape. Then I will use a transform node and I'm going to scale down in the z-axis, so in the y-axis. So y will be 0. So in the case that, for example, a point is going upwards, we will just scale it back down to its normal size. Then using the lap tool thicken to then extrude both sides. So laps thicken. We have here a depth control and we can here have a toggle for extruding in both directions. So now we have this shape and we can control how far this goes. And further from here, we can do a poly bevel. And this will then bevel the whole result. We can also here ignore flat edges, and we can then say that it specifically needs to bevel only where it's 90 degrees or less, like here. Then what I also like to do here is to go to my divisions. Let's increase this to 4 and go to a ramp mode. And here I can have then a ramp that basically controls how the bevel should go, which is very useful. Also, if you open here the fully values of each point, we can actually go negative and we can push this in more. And that's what I actually want. So that can be interesting. So I'm going to set the divisions to 2 to have a decent geometry. And now I have this result. So I can control some of the shapes like this and make it a bit more interesting if I want to. Then further from here, to be sure, I like to place a fuse node. So this fuse node will make sure if points are too close, then we just fuse them together. Also in the bevel node, polybeveling, what is interesting is when we open our collision and limits, our loops is now set to individual, which is important to know. Then we can do another bevel. And this bevel is just a general bevel here to make everything a bit rounder if you want that. So this is basically then my first shape, so just a basic extrusion from our curve. So I can still here control how this thing goes and have a more specific shape if I want that. Now from here, like I mentioned, I maybe want to have an option to open or close it. So I'm going to have the add node here again. This is then the closed version, but in here, so this is then the closed version, and I would like to use a switch node. So I don't always want to have an open version, so I can just switch that output. Then we can simply use the sweep node, sweep the result. Then for the sweep node, we can use the default values. And like you can see here, we can have a round tube by default. And let's check if the other version is working. So we can then close them or open them. What could also be interesting is to actually use a custom input. So let's say I have a custom circle like this. Make sure it's set to a polygon type. Let's put that in here. And let's use the second input. So now we have the circle. Might need to reverse the crossing here. And to then improve on this, we can, for example, place a simple transform here. And when we squeeze our input circle, we will sort of then also scale our sweep nicely. So that could be also nice to then control, and we can then use this to, for example, subtract from a terrain. If you want to have a certain flow in your terrain or canyon or something, that can easily subtract it. Notice also that we can, in the sweep here, go to construction, and we can set then here our up target. So if you want to have a nicely up direction, then you're going to make sure it's set to y-axis with the up factor on. And this is then our second shape. We can already also here use a switch node. So first is this shape, then comes this shape, and now I will be making the third shape. So for the third shape, I want to copy models on the line. I will be starting out with a resample node and resampling the line, and also set here this to subdivide curve, so we have a nice round curve. Now at the moment, probably 0.1 will be too much, so let's play around with some of the values here. So we have a nice couple points there. Then what we can do is, I want to, for example, have a tube copied on the points. So I'm going to place down a tube here, transform this into a shape that could be used for a mountain, making sure we are using primitives, close the gaps, and now we could do a copy to point, and you will now have the tubes copied on there. You could also do a copy to curves. That could also be interesting. So we have a more specific copying. As you could see here, it already gives us a different result. So that could here also be interesting to play around where they should actually face. So based on what you prefer, you can choose one of the two here. But at the moment, I'm going to go and stick with the copy to points. Also here, I'm actually going to make sure this is nicely aligned on the grid. So when I have my curve here, they are actually on my curve. Then to improve on this, we can add a noise attribute. And in this noise attribute, I want to actually store a value called the p-scale, which controls our overall scale from our input. So as you can now see, our scaling has now difference. Also important is I actually need to set my p-scale to a 1D type. It's one-dimensional, or it's just one float and not a vector. A feature I personally like is enabling here the remapping. And with the remapping, I can basically control the largest and the minimum sizes that we have. So I really like using these remapping. Further down here, we have some size control, like how much variation should there be between each other. So we can play around with these values, and we have offset values here as well. Then here again, I want to add an option that my line is closed. And then in this area, I'm just going to scatter out points, and these points will then be my mountains. So here again, I'm just going to copy paste the add node. Then I have this shape, and the simplest way to get some points in there is to use the scatter node. So we can actually scatter points in there. As you can see, we have scattered points in here. And now we have 1000, which is way too much. So let's set this to maybe 14. And I will then use a switch node and switch between these two types. So let's see how the other one is doing. So we have this result now, just a bunch of shapes copied in there. In here, I want to actually improve this even more. the shape that is in the middle copy, the tubes that are in the middle, to be the big ones, and the tubes that are on the edge here, I want those to be the small ones. So I would like to see sort of a gradient. So one way you can do this is here. I'm going to divide the shape and I'm going to triangulate it. So we have triangulated, and I will do a subdivision. You can also, for example, do a remeshing. You can choose that, but I think subdivision will be a bit faster if you are using this tool in a large space. And then in here, we're going to increase this to, let's say, 3. And we're going to also click here, override or weight, and let's set this to 10. So basically saying that it sticks to our original shape. If you don't have this weight, it will sort of like do the classic sub-D and smooth it out. But in here, I would like to sort of make sure it sort of have a weight. Maybe a little bit smoothing can be useful here. Now there is also a cool labs node that's called distance from border. And the name itself already says what it's doing, so the distance from the border. So you can see that our border has this more darker color. So we can here already play around with the radius, and we can sort of slowly fade that more out. You could also play around here with the ramping to control more the output, but the radius here is the most useful. Now, plugging this into my scatter, I can use actually this color as my scattering density. We're going to use an attribute that controls my density. So at the moment, density doesn't exist because I use a color as my density. So I'm going to remove density and place it with my color. You can see that I have 5,000 points, but most of my density is here in the middle of the primitive. And the edges here have a few points with a lot of spacing between each other. So we can use this to control my density. So basically now, playing around more with this value, we can really define that we need the shapes in the center of this piece and define that. Then further from here, what we can do is we can use a rename attribute, and we can rename our color into a p-scale. So p-scale. If I would open my attributes quickly, we now have saved our color in the p-scale. So basically, the points here in the middle will have the larger values, which will be 1, 0.9, 0.7, and then the points here on the side will have lower values, like here, 0.2. So that means that points nearing the edge here will be scaled smaller. So this is the result now. And as you can see, we now have smaller scaling nearing the edge. So, but there might be a big difference in scale here. So we could always play around with the values. So you could like grab a quick wrangle node and write a very small expression. You can say at the current scale, I want to divide the current scale by 2, for example, just to make it like a bit more consistent. Or maybe 2 is not enough, then let's say 5. Let's see if that works better. So now I would say we are more consistently in how the shape are sized. And this is then my third input. Now also here important, let's activate our instancing. So in game engine, we can actually still control what shape is being used. And this is almost done. So select everything, collapse this into subnetwork, right click, digital asset, and I'm going to call this procedural terrain. And this is my blockout tool. And then here, I'm going to go to the parameter tab. So important parameters here. Let's also make a folder. So this is my method 1. So method 1 will be, I will call this fill shape. So just filling the area in geometry. Then I would call it a sweep is my second method. And my third method is then basically copy shapes. So here now And let's start out with here the depth. So the depth or extrusion. I think extrusion might be a bit more clear. Then here we have a bevel profile corner. This is the one with the profile. And then here I would call this a general bevel. Then here we have the sweep. So here I'm gonna drag this here and make this a toggle. And this can be then for closing the shape. So close shape. Then further here, I want to have here the scale. So just the general scaling. Then here as well, I want to use the Y scale. So scale Y. You can have more options, like you can have the number of divisions, or you can have the certain orientation here if you want to get very specific. Or what could also be cool is here to, for example, close the caps. I think I will expose this one, so you can actually close the cap. And here then for copying shapes, I will here have the resample. So spacing. Then I will also here have the amount. I would say scatter amount. And then we have here our general noise. I will create here minimum and maximum, and just gonna put the scale in front of it. So scale minimum, scale maximum. And of course here I want to use this toggle, and I'm gonna call this scatter in shape. And I'm gonna create a toggle from this. And lastly here, let's just expose this value at the top, and then just gonna call it method. And this will be a menu. I'm gonna create a menu. Then we have a token and a label. So we have 0, which is the fill shape. Then we have 1, which is the sweep. Then we have 2, which is then copy shapes. Apply. And to make sure, we're going to place down an output node here to always output this shape. Last thing before we're going to use this tool is we can go here to our node type. And in here we have our curve, and I want to expose this as an editable node. So you can click this icon here, and we can look here for our curve. So here we have curve 1. So make sure you choose the right one. And now it says curve 1. So this will be editable in Game Engine. So let's press accept. And then here we have our little menu. So you can here increase the amount, play around with the bevel. You can here sweep the shape as well. We can also close this grid-like. And in here we have also the copy method. And we can also say scatter inside. So we're scattering in this area. What could also be nice is that we actually hide this value over here. When this toggle is enabled, we want to hide this value, and when this toggle is disabled, I want to hide the scatter amount. So here in our parameters, I'm gonna go here. We have here options to hide and disable. So I'm gonna use the hide, and in here I want to copy the name. So here the spacing, I need to hide it when. So I'm gonna say input 2. If it would be equal to 1, then it needs to be hidden. So apply, test this out quickly. So when this is on or value 1, we will hide the value. Then same for here, but then of course the 0. So when it's off, hide that value. Now, since we're also here, let's also change some of the ranges. And you can go over each parameter and set a decent range if you want that. So now our tool is ready to bring in Game Engine and test it out. Here in Unreal, I have loaded in the asset. We can also see we have our curve, so I can move my curve around. I can tweak the shape if I want to, and we can get a more specific shape to guide our level. Again, here we can just simply switch to, for example, sweeping or copy meshing like this, where we can quickly create mountains. So now let's test out the fill shape. So how do we integrate this? There are multiple ways. So let's place here our model. So in here I want to have a certain surface or shape. So how to use this is you can change this input to a few things. So either we can, for example, here use digital assets. So this is basically inputting another digital asset into a digital asset. As you can see, this is already working. But this is sort of limited into only one selection. So you can see current selection, it's only allowing one at a time. It allows us to do very interactive way. So I could still, as you can see, I can still edit the curve and my terrain would interact with this. So that's a plus side of it. It's super interactive. And the other one that I used before was the world outliner. So I already added it here. So it's already selected. And you can see it works very similar. So my shape is being projected in there. But when I would move my curve around, it's sort of less interactive. Now, one way to just fix this is just clicking Rebuild Asset. And now we have the updated version. So you're going to have to choose what you prefer. If you want to have something a bit more interactive, then it can be useful to use the asset mode. But if you just move the shape around, you can see that we can also have a quite interactive way of working. Now, another option here as well is we can actually bake this into an actor. It's going to bake this digital asset into a normal geometry, so we can actually just use normal geometry. So here are a few examples of geometry that I baked. So these are just simple shapes generated from this tool. And as you can see, they are just static mesh, so they're not a digital asset anymore. So it could also be a good idea to make a few different shapes, then bake the shapes, and then the user is free to then use these shapes to then define their levels more. Now let's test out here my copy shapes, because I think that will be quite interesting to have here. I want to use this to, for example, create a mountain around my plane. Now, as you can see now, I have these mountains based on that tool. So that was the initial idea to quickly create these mountains. So maybe these tubes are maybe too heavy in their slope. So you could easily also have a parameter to squeeze this a bit more, so the mountains are not that heavy. So that was it for the Blockout tool. It just helps with creating levels and specific shapes. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.